Welcome back to part 3 of Leading the Revolution with our guest, Gary Hamel. You're very, very welcome back.
Thank you, Aiden. Nice to continue the conversation.
It sure is. There's 2 chapters I'd love to get through today. I was telling Gary, I've been collecting quotes that I'm going to share to our audience as well from the books. I could actually write a book of quotes from all the books we've covered so far. But I'm going to tee us up here for this idea of being your own seer. And really, the principle of this chapter is don't rely on other people. You have to do it yourself because it has to be in your own context. And I loved how you started off here. You said, there are too many individuals who cannot yet escape the dead hand of precedent. Too many who are not fully vested in the future. Too many who cannot distinguish between their heritage and their destiny. Is this you? Want to do something about it? More and more innovation comes not from the triumph of big science, but from the triumph of contrarianism. It is the idiot savant who asks a fresh question, who then answers it using parts that already exist, who is also often the author of the new. That's because industry revolution is conceptual innovation. It comes from the mind and soul of a malcontent, a dreamer, a smartass, and not from some bespectacled boffin or besuited planner. I absolutely love that. And it speaks to this idea of psychological safety to speak up, creating the conditions where people can come forward and talk about things. And what you ultimately say here is companies fail to create the future, not because they fail to predict it, but because they fail to imagine it. It is curiosity and creativity they lack, not perspicuity. It is vitally important that you understand the distinction between the future and the unimagined, between knowing what's next and imagining what's possible.
Yeah, boy, it's been a long time since I heard those words. They're pretty good, actually, Aiden, you know? I'll claim that.
You forgot, man. You forgot. There's so many. Look behind me here. There's so many you've written in the meantime that's why.
No. Well, I do think there is a need for every individual and for every company to develop foresight. And as I say, foresight is not primarily about prediction. It is much more about imagination. I got very interested in this question when I was a young faculty member. One of the questions that really intrigued me is, well, where do all these new game-changing innovations come from? Like, once you see it, you go like, well, that's cool. That makes 100% sense. But like, where did it come from? And when you go back, and I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of entrepreneurs, many, many years ago. It was a different kind of population we have today. But what you discover is they weren't smarter than the rest of us. They didn't have any communication with the Almighty, but they had a different way of seeing. And what became clear to me is that foresight is as much imagination as it is prediction. But it's not imagination without context. It's not like you have a fever dream and it's all informed by experiences these people had and the context they were in and frustrations they saw among users and technologies they could see that were being commercialized and putting those things together. And it was often born out of serendipity, right? You just happen to be in a particular place and go, wow, that doesn't make any sense. Can I change that? And so a lot of what I've tried to do is understand, okay, what are those perceptual habits? How do you develop them in yourself so you're able to imagine what could be? And then how do you build an organization where you can never program innovation, in the same way you can, program a piece of software, but you can create the conditions. So how do you build a lightning rod so that like maybe lightning strikes at least more often than it would otherwise? But the starting point is to really have a theory and an understanding of where do these ideas come from and how do I develop this capacity to see around corners, to see over the horizon, to reimagine what could be. And the exciting thing for me in my career is I learned you can teach that and you can build that. I think often, particularly in Silicon Valley, where I spend a lot of my time, they like to tell themselves that this innovation is just like this incredible, brilliant mind. And there are not many of them about. And you'll probably never be able to do it, right? Well, after you've trained 100,000 people to think in this way, and you've seen new businesses and billions of dollars of market value going on, and no, guys, this is not that complicated. Weirdly, almost nobody actually does it seriously, but this is not neuroscience. It's much more straightforward.
I loved what you said. You share throughout the book other books you've read, but also quotes that you loved. And one of your favorites you mentioned at the time was Alan Kay, who wrote, "Perspective is worth 80 IQ points." And you say Alan knows that a fresh way of seeing is often more valuable than sheer brain power. And then you go on to say Impressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, Postmodernism, each revolution in art was based on a reconception of reality. It wasn't the canvas, pigments, or brushes that changed, but how the artist perceived the world. In the same sense, it's not the tools that distinguish industry revolutionaries from humdrum incumbents, not the information technology they harness, not the processes they use, not their faculties. Instead, it is their ability to escape the stranglehold of the familiar. And here you go on to share ways we can school ourselves in the art of seeing past the familiar or to the truly novel. Maybe you'll share some of these. So I'll jog your memory as well, because you give loads here. And this is probably work you were doing with companies at the time. You went, look, let's just lay it out there. So I highly recommend people get the book. There's loads of stuff in there. If you're struggling with your imagination, Gary gives a list of things you can do. One of them you say is what you call discontinuities. And you said change revolutionaries are looking for things where the rate of change is changing, for inflection points that foreshadow significant discontinuities. Those who fail to notice these nascent discontinuities will be rudely awakened by those who were paying attention. And this is to your point that you've said throughout this whole series. Most companies know, they see the change happening. You worked with Nokia at both points when they created the phone, when they created the industry, and then they failed to take notice when there was an inflection point or discontinuity again.
Yeah, I think you have a dilemma in many organizations where the people kind of control strategy and are supposed to set vision. They have a very kind of narrow set of interactions, right? Most of them internal for sure. And they show up at Davos and they talk to their senior team and so on. But they do not actually invest in getting out the fringes where change happens, right? Change does not start in the mainstream, whether it's fashion, whether it's music, whether it's architecture, whether it's technology, it starts out on the fringes. And if you're not out there learning from that, and it takes an investment, but I do think you want to ask yourself, whether it's politics, whether it is technology, science, lifestyles, what is accelerating, what's changing, that most people in my industry are still ignoring. Because by the time we have Accenture, McKinsey telling you how important this thing is, you're probably too late. I mean, you're still going to have to do it. You're still going to have to understand AI or whatever the technology du jour. But most of the economic value has probably already been captured by somebody else. So you do have to be your own Seer. You cannot, rely on somebody else to come and package this all up and tell you what the implications are. You have to make that investment. And most companies are very insular. Most of the senior leadership is spent inside the four walls, and you're just going to be surprised if that's your MO. I mean, one of the things that when I wrote the book we're talking about now, Leading the Revolution, that was around 2000. I moved to Silicon Valley in 1993 from London back to the US. And, I just had a ringside seat to what was going on. And every day I'm rubbing shoulders with people who are inventing the future and working out on the bleeding edge of technology and so on. It's not that I was any better at anybody else in particular in the future. I was just immersed in it all the time. And so you say like, well, that's interesting. Where might that lead? I think the other really critical thing when you see something that's accelerating or something catches your eye is to really have the discipline to work through the second or third order consequences. Like, therefore, what happens? And you see the smartphone and photographs go like, well, we're going to have interesting privacy concerns out of that. That's going to be a whole industry probably, or a whole set of issues that are going to come around that. Or you see early Napster and you go like, wow, okay, there's a way of immediate sharing now. So how do I think about where that goes in my industry? Peer-to-peer, user-generated content. How might that be monetized? How do I, So it's not simply noticing a trend, but it's having the discipline to work through the implications. If then, and like, okay, where does that lead and how might I harness it? It's obviously very important to put these trends together, because when you look at innovation, it's almost never one insight. It's a combination of insights about users, about technology, about industry incumbents, about where they're blind. And somebody goes like, okay, I can put this all together. And so that's why one of the things that I've long believed is that you cannot really innovate and you can't create an innovation strategy unless you, first of all, build a foundation of new insights, right? You have to know things. And I say, No, not in the sense of it's just a hunch, but you have to see things, know things are changing, know what's happening, and you have to have a set of insights that you are not going to find in your competitors, right? That didn't get off of some chat GPT list of what's changing in the world, what's important or whatever, but that you've seen for yourself. Because you can't build a differentiated strategy or differentiated product or business model unless you have differentiated insights to start with. So, yeah, and that's a piece that often gets missed. So when I've worked with organizations, before asking like, well, what are the new products and new businesses and so on, we start by saying, let's build a deep population of new insights, of things that we know, we've seen, that they're grounded in reality. It's not a fantasy. But we also know that probably very few of our competitors are paying attention to these. Very few have thought deeply about them. And I will say the other thing here that's super important, Aiden. Those insights need to be shared, because you can have 2 or 3 different people who will see the same thing and draw completely different conclusions out of it. So when you start to share these insights, and so in the work we do, we'll create hundreds of these sorts of insights. They're all up online. We put them where everybody across the company can see, okay, here's what we saw. Here's actually like the data behind it. Here's some of the implications and we let people comment on that and build that. Oh yeah, I saw that too, or I saw something over here. And so when you have multiple minds all mulling on the same population of insights, you get a huge explosion of ideas rather than hoping like it's just one person who has some kind of brain fart and sees it. So you have to have differentiated insights. They have to be shared across the organization because people are going to see different things out of that.
I love that, man. I was telling you, I was quoting you loads, and I have this reinvention summit starting in April, and I was sharing your quote because one of the things we're trying to do with that is get people into an environment where they rub shoulders with different people and have conversations and have enough time. And you say in this book, you recognize then, this was before the onslaught of information we have now. You said, how ironic, in a world populated by knowledge workers, there is virtually no time to think. You may be able to manage the present in tiny splinters of time, but you certainly can't innovate if your attention has been smashed into minute-sized shards. I thought that was so prophetic, but also that was the experience people were having then, and now it's way worse.
Yeah, I think that one of the greatest personal advantages one can have in your career is just the discipline to reflect and to take time and to think. And what works against that is not just like only the inbox and all the things that are coming at you every day. What works against it is also the fact that all of our media now is so addictive, is all built around 30-second, 1-minute clips and so on. And it's like going off of crack or alcohol or something else to sit back and say, no, I got to clear my mind. I want to think through it. So yeah, in a world of fragmented attention, concentration is a competitive advantage. But it takes work to do that.
Absolutely. And you don't get rewarded for it is the other problem. You think about someone like Zhang Ruman, who you work with, the CEO and founder of Hire. And what I was struck by is he got all your books translated into Mandarin and loads of other thought leaders as well. And he actually read them. And then he thought you out. And that intellectual humility is one of the reasons why Hire is probably one of the most valuables and will become one of the most valuable companies in the world. I think that's a really important point because we have this bias for action instead of a bias for thinking plus a bias for action.
Yeah, I think that's true. And also I think what distinguishes Zhang Ruman and not many other leaders I can think of, they understood that management is maybe humankind's most important social technology. Like how we bring people together, how we motivate them, how we coordinate across units, how we set goals, how we plan. And so he wanted to deeply understand what the state of the art was there. But he also understood, like, if I want to build an amazing company, the state of the art is not good enough, right? I got to push the boundaries farther. And I think so many leaders, they just take that all for granted. And in other words, and we'll come to this later, but when you talk about innovation, we tend to think products and services, but by far the most important innovation is innovation in how we lead, manage, control, and so on. And that gets almost no attention at all in organizations. But yeah, I think, now, when I wrote all those years ago, is it still relevant? I think so. But of course, now you have things like Y Combinator, all of these incubators where they will help you probably understand the future. see opportunities and so on. But I think even there, they take people who already have an insight, who already have had an epiphany. And how do we help you build a business? And I think in an organization, the starting point has to be, how do I build that foundation of interesting, unconventional insights that will be the building blocks for genuine innovation? And it's just something that I think gets missed. I know very few. In many organizations, you'll have a unit. For example, a company like Procter & Gamble have people go out and live in customers' homes and try to get insights on people's lives and their frustrations with their products and how they're treating their houses and so on. But my question is, like, how broadly do those insights get shared across the company? Right? Is that like just some people in product development, or everybody across the company has a chance? Number two is, okay, do you take those insights and do you also have literally in the same space where people see the insights about what technology is doing and new material science and so on? And do you have insights at the same place about what your competitors are doing and what their value proposition is and how they're positioned? We cut all these insights up and they're spread across different parts of the organization. So the average individual just does not have the grist for the mill. They just don't have enough in front of them because they're like, wow, okay, there's a chance to do something very interesting there.
I was telling you, I was just speaking to Eric von Hippel, and I mentioned you in that episode, but I was telling him I read this amazing study by Robert Sapolsky. And Robert Sapolsky, in his book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, it's about stress. But he was talking about the discovery of type A personalities. And there was a guy called Meyer and another cardiologist called Meyer and another one called Rosenman. And they discovered type A personalities. But what happened was an upholsterer came into their office. So they'd noticed that their seats were getting destroyed. And they just assumed this was the rate of change of these seats, that people were destroying them. But the upholsterer comes in and goes, man, what the hell are you doing to your patients in here? Because they were all scratched and worn. And they discovered that it was their type A personalities who were so eager to get in and out of the clinics that they were scratching the seats because they were so nervous. And Sapolsky had this brilliant line I thought of when I was reading this chapter. He said that if you want to know if the elephant in the zoo is sick, don't ask the vet, ask the cage cleaner. And I was thinking about how it's the same as asking a consultant versus asking the people out in the field. And it segues beautifully to what you said. You have to search out underappreciated trends. You said there is no proprietary data about the future. Whatever you can know about what's changing in the world, so can anyone else. So you've got to look where others are not looking. But the good news is that people in an industry are blind in the same way. They are all paying attention to the same things and not paying attention to the same things. And I thought that was really interesting, that almost having some charges to go looking for these trends versus going to a conference once and not doing anything about it, or listen to a TED talk or reading The Economist, and how to bring that into the culture.
You know, the early work I did, and we've done this, multiple times through the years, but in a large company, we'll put teams together with maybe 20 or 30 people on a team. And first of all, we need these people for maybe 2 or 3 months. And it's interesting. I was working with one of the very large automakers, which everybody would know, and they were and are kind of stuck. And they said, hey, Gary, we really have to get in front of the future. We have to wait. And I said, okay, you have like about 250,000 employees. I'm going to need about 120 of them for 4 or 5 months. You thought I'd ask them, like, I don't know what, but they said, it's impossible. I said, you guys have so much waste and so much slack. And you're telling me, and so this is one of the places where the rubber meets the road. Like, yeah, we need to have a point of view about the future. We need to get in front, but we can't spare any cycles, any intellectual time, anybody. Well, all right, then let's just go back to turning the crank. But in any case, often we'll take 25, 30 people times 4 teams, so 100 or more than 100 people. And we'll have one team spend a month trying to understand what are the nascent changes, what's accelerating, what are the implications, who's driving it, has anybody exploited it? We'll have another team spend a month digging into all of the competitors and saying, where are they all blind? Where are they all have overlapping assumptions of business models and so on, and what part of that might we build? We'll have another group reconceiving their own organization and thinking about it not as a portfolio of products and services, but what are the deep skills and technologies that we have? I think right now about Apple. Apple probably has a wider range of technologies than almost any company in the world. And yet all of it is focused on this little thing called the iPhone, right? Or maybe a Mac. And you go like, guys, let's step back and think about what you know and where else can you exploit that, right? But you have this, and what's very interesting, Steve Jobs changed Apple's name from Apple Computer to Apple because he said, I don't think we're like they're broader, but I think now they've gotten stuck. It's essentially the iPhone company, right? So this is a super critical thing to do, is to challenge the prevailing conception of who we are as a company, which is almost always defined in product terms, and say, no. Like, what are the deep things we know how to do? What are the skills? What are the competencies? We'll have a team kind of digging and drilling down through that, and how much of those things are really unique and world-class. And then we'll have another team that is interacting with customers and out in the field and understanding what are the frustrations, the anxieties, the unspoken needs. And each of those teams is going to bring back hundreds of insights. And then we share those, and I'll go deep in the process if people are interested. But I do think that is just a critically missed step. And every time we've done it, there are whole new business created, a lot of market value gets created. But we talked about taking the time as an individual, but setting aside the time as an organization to explore those fringes and to bring those insights together. Hire is very good at this now. They use a lot of technology to do that. All of those things are shared internally and externally because they want their potential partners to look at, hey, here's what we're learning. Do you see an opportunity here we're missing? They're not proprietary about that. And then come help us build it. But yeah, it's the investment in the foundations of innovation. It just doesn't happen in most organizations, or it's very sporadic or very fragmented.
Most innovation is actually innovation theater. It's not real to that point. I went right back to Joe Bauer, who was Clay Christensen's thesis advisor. I'm doing a series with him, Gary, after when we're finished.
Very good. Say hello to him for me.
Yeah,
he was very influential in my own works.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I'll let him know, and maybe we'll have you on that series as well, because he's a load of guests on that series. It's kind of like This Is Your Life, one of those episodes. But the resource allocation process that he talks about, to your point, people won't allocate the human resource to that because it's seen as putting a pause on the company, or we're not measured for that yet, or what will Wall Street think? Instead of actually going, okay, well, let's have maybe lower managers. We'll give them a responsibility now to run the company now that it's running, and we'll focus on the future. And how do you bring that into companies? How do you bring in that real step change to go, we're running this thing differently from now on?
Well, I think in my experience, there's a couple of things that have to happen. Number one, the company has to be pretty dissatisfied with where they are. They have to understand, like, hey, we've missed some big opportunities. We're not growing. The top line doesn't look very good. Our margins under pressure. So you have to have a business imperative to do this. I think the other thing, it just requires a lot of humility. When we did some of this work for a big sportswear company, the CEO kind of put out a video blog and said, guys, we're not growing as fast. We're all dissatisfied. We at the top cannot tell you what to do. We don't know what to do. If we had the answer, we would have figured it out by now. So you have to have also that kind of humility to say, hey, we need to learn from everybody. This is a few people at the top. We're going to figure this thing out. And then, of course, as we were just talking, you have to create some slack in the organization for it to happen. And in many cases, all three of those things are missing, right? Rather than being like super honest about kind of mediocrity and flatlining, it's like, it's this problem, it's that problem. So there's a lot of excuse making. There's a sense that if I ask the whole organization to help in this in a very open, transparent way, I lose control. I cannot predict the answer. I cannot see the end from the beginning. And that makes me like super nervous, because like, what if they come back with ideas that like we don't want to do? And then thirdly, just cutting through all the busyness and say, hey, we're going to invest here. Yeah, those conditions are often missing. And so companies stumble, and at some point, activist investors force you to do things, you didn't want to do anyway, and it's too late. And I think part of the problem, Aiden, is so many leaders really see their role as running something rather than reimagining or building or changing it, right? If I'm a top leader and I'm spending 80 to 90% of my time on basically running the business and fighting outside fires, regulators, other things as it happens, like I am not doing my job. But that's the reality.
And some of this stuff's quite simple. Like if you're a reader of a paper, a newspaper or website, whatever it might be, or a journal, you say, find the big story. And I thought this was really interesting. I was saying to you, I bet you loads of companies were reading your book and going, I'm going to do that. I don't have any ideas, but I'm going to do what Hamel says here. Because you said, search for transcendent themes. So these overarching themes. And you said one of the reasons many people fail to fully appreciate what's changing is because they're down at ground level, lost in the thicket of confusing, conflicting data. You have to make time to step back and ask yourself, what's the big story that cuts across all these little facts? And the example you gave in the book was to consider trends. So several trends, but they're everywhere. And one of them was in most developed countries, people are getting married later in life. No longer do people expect to find a mate while still at school. They have more time at work. They're not getting out as much. They're not drinking as much. Hence, what about a dating site? And so reminding people this was the noughties, that this was 2000 you wrote this book. And therefore, you saw a rise in Match.com and all these kind of companies companies like that. But I just wanted to remind you of that. And they go, what's the one at the moment that you're seeing? Like, so some of these big stories that you're seeing, you're going, why is nobody doing this?
I have a list of those things that I think are interesting. One of them that I think is pretty current is, and I think we see it now, but I think most people, certainly business people and government people, still don't want to face up to it. It's just this incredible divide between the elite and everybody else. And the fact that a huge number of people in societies across Europe, North America, elsewhere just feel completely disenfranchised. I started looking at this data some while ago, and people just don't, a lot of this, I think, Aidan, is we just have a pain avoidance. You look at something that looks uncomfortable and you don't want to think about what's really going on here and what are we going to do about it. But you look at data where a significant majority, like 2/3 of kids in Great Britain, think they would be better off living in a socialist system. Now, they can't tell you where a socialist system has worked, but that gives you a sense. Vast majority of people across the developed world thinks that government, media, and business works for the few rather than the many. Right? Now this has become unavoidable, and you see Trump and whatever. But you could have seen this a decade ago. If you're looking at the data, if you're looking at the frustrations that people have, if you're looking at the declining middle class, if you're looking at where wealth is going in society, where 90% of it is going to the top 1%, this is going to become an issue. And it was very interesting and I tend to be as apolitical as I can be, but, in Trump's first victory, people literally were shocked. What the hell is going on? How could this happen? I'm going, you people certainly have not been paying attention, right? You're in your own freaking bubble. And you didn't really even need to go to talk to people. All you need to do look is all the surveys are being done and see this like deep well of frustration that's there. So I think that's certainly one thing that you could have seen a long way off, and most didn't. And most politicians are still surprised, and many, and probably 90% of the people at Davos are still in denial about this. Like, guys, and on the back foot, right? So, yeah, I think, again, getting the bigger picture means having a lot of different sources of data, trying every day to read things and consume things that are not in your usual diet. So if you have here's the 3 things I read every day. No, you got to diversify that. You got to look much farther afield. But I will also say, spending some time, understanding history, understanding philosophy, understanding theology also helps you see what's the deeper things that are often going on, right? That are kind of fundamental changes in how in self-perception, or how people see their role in society, or what they think the role of government is or businesses. And that's very hard to see if you're not getting data from multiple sources and multiple perspectives rather than being inside of your little tribe. And number 2, if you don't have the historical or the broader context to make sense of that.
I'm going to bring it back to something you talked about, which was the orders of impact. And you said that the world is a system And we really saw that during COVID, the whole idea of VUCA, the complexity, something changes here and it will affect something over here, waterbed effect. And you mentioned Paul Sappho and this idea of orders of impact. And you mentioned a brilliant analogy in the book that I'd love you to riff on. You said the speed of the internet's takeoff surprised most people, but that it should have happened. It was no surprise because the interstate highway system provided an almost perfect historical analogy. Bear with me as I tell you this quickly. The automobile had existed for 50 years before the interstate highway system began to connect communities across America. Within a decade of the interstate's introduction, suburbs started springing up. City centers were withering. Corporations were building office towers in what had been cornfields, and commuters were commuting. It wasn't the car per se, but the ability to connect communities that changed the distribution of work and commerce. Likewise, computers had existed for 50 years before the internet took off. Before the net, computers had been islands of computational power. Once connected, they began to transform society in ways even more dramatic than the interstate highway, but also in ways that are entirely consistent with timeless aspects of nature. I thought that was brilliant because when you grasp that and you see things in the rearview mirror, you can start looking outside the windscreen and going, well, where are things going now? And I wondered, what was your version of that now?
I mean, one of the things that, again, this is the value of sometimes like understanding the deeper things. Any technology that connects people together, whether that was a path 300 years ago, or whether it was smoke signals from Native Americans, or whether it is a telegraph or phone and so on, anything that connects people is going to have enormous impact. And you take that connectivity and it's exploded in terms of mobile data and communication density and so on. Social media was inevitable. You could tell. I mean, you go back to the earliest things where people were starting to be on online forums and you could rate each other's comments. This was happening by the time I wrote that book. It wasn't hard to see that's going to be like an enormous business of peer-to-peer in whatever way that, turns out, sharing content and so on. So if you ask me what are some of the things I think are likely looking forward, I think many, many customers today are deeply, deeply frustrated. Is it because I think companies in many ways have used technology to degrade the customer experience. It's harder to talk to a human being. You're forced through apps that are often very poorly designed, not easy to use. So I think if I'm a business, I'm saying in every industry, there's a deep, deep well of customer frustration that we're not even paying attention to. And because we're all focused on we can save a little bit here and there. So that's one thing that's I think somebody could think about, because one of the other really broad themes that I think has been true for now 20 years, at least in terms of the newcomers, is basically reinventing every industry from the customer backwards. Right. And thinking, okay, what's the core function we're trying to do? How do we deliver this in a much more seamless, interesting way? Uber would be an example of that. Airbnb would be an example of that. Kindle and Amazon would be an example. But there are many industries where that still really hasn't happened. So I think that's, deep, deep well of frustration as technology has been used often to push customers away rather than to bring them closer. So I think that's kind of an enormous opportunity. I think another thing I see happening is just the way we build knowledge and consume knowledge is going to change fundamentally. It's partly thanks to ChatGPT, but partly because universities have fundamentally failed young people. They're not teaching them what they need to do. They're become kind of indoctrination centers and nice retreats to spend a few years. And kids are desperate to know, what are the skills I need to make a difference? How do I build my portfolio of interesting projects? I think there's an enormous opportunity for entirely new educational models to emerge. It's not just going to be take an online course, but things that are much more thoughtful than that are really focused on building skills that are measurable, that are quantifiable, where you leave not with kind of a degree, but you leave with a set of certificates that you've mastered these things. And so that, if you just look at the sorry state of education, you look at kids who are desperate to make an impact, the fact that 2/3 of kids who come out of university don't work in the field of their degree, it has to be just a freaking huge opportunity in there somewhere, right? So, yeah, you look at any of these things and that's the beauty. Once you teach yourself to walk through the world and say, okay, what does everybody believe here? This kind of nonsense. Where's the deep wells of frustration that nobody's addressing, that everybody's ignoring? What are the technologies that we're using to do this, but could actually be used to do this? Like, the world is just filled with opportunities. There's a dozen different companies I would have liked to start. Here, I'll give one idea away for free. Maybe somebody's done this by now. You go to a restaurant and they give you this long wine menu and all the prices are super inflated. But also, you have no idea what are the good wines and what are the bad wines. So you can sit there with your phone and maybe going to wine.com or something. I just want to snap a photo with my phone, use character recognition. Then I wanted to go to a database, find the wines, take the prices, and tell me what are the best, what's the best ratio of quality wine to price. Like, somebody could just do that tomorrow, right? It's not hard. And that's a 15-year-old idea at least. So maybe somebody's done around it. But yeah, I think. And by the way, you just become a lot more optimistic when you develop those kind of thinking skills, because like there's just like amazing cool things we can do everywhere.
There was one you mentioned in the book with the hotel hangars. Do you remember that one?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the other point, is that, these industry orthodoxies come in all different sizes, which is why, I need people on the front lines thinking about this, not just, but that little example used there was, obviously you can challenge the big orthodoxy that hospitality means I own a physical building with rooms that are all alike and whatever, versus Airbnb or something else. But then you think about the customer experience where you go in even to like maybe a 4-star hotel and the hangars are all like secured in the closet, like they're locked down. And you go like, man, so they really don't trust me, do they? Like, they have my credit card information, but they don't trust me with a hanger that's worth £4 or $4 or something. So, put a sign behind the door, say hangers $5, and like do an inventory the same way you do a mini bar and make it a profit center, right? Again, those things are just like everywhere, but we all start to blind and we mistake the edge of for the horizon. But when you train people like, okay, what are we doing every day that just doesn't make sense, that frustrates customers, that doesn't create economic value, those things will very quickly come to the surface.
And the one I thought is like, sometimes you as a customer, like I'm one of those people who will say it to the people. I go, what would be really useful? And you can see their eyes glaze over and they're just going, when will this guy be out of my face? And you just go, why would I bother? But if you had somewhere to capture that, would be so good.
Well, there's a whole business there, Aiden, because you're absolutely right. You have people like you, like me, like everybody listening, who every day, you have a customer experience that like, hey, there's a simple fix here. You could do this like better. And there's literally no place to go. Your choice is you talk to an employee in that moment who has no way of sharing that, who is completely disempowered, can't change it, is just helpless, feels bad for you, but can't crap about it. Or you go to some online complaint thing or whatever that disappears, whatever. Of course, which is why people today who are really pissed off, you put it on social media, and then maybe somebody's going to like pay attention. If you have a few thousand followers, you might get a response. But you start to, there was I don't know if they still do this. There was a U.S. consumer electronics retailer called Best Buy that had something called Voice of the Customer through the Employee, Voce, Best Buy. And it was really simple. On the terminals, the screens in the store at the point of sale, if the customer says something, there's just a little place you can click and say, this is what we just were asked about this. And I talk about this in one of my books. They were mining tens of thousands of these comments every year. So just imagine something that is that simple. I know at one point, British Airways, when they were serious about service, I'm not sure they still are now, but they had video kiosks. And when you came off the airplane and you wanted to say, you just like walked up, pushed a button and said, hey, guys, here's something else you could do, right? And I think a lot of companies, so what do we have instead? What we have instead is at the end of every damn interaction, they want you to like rate somebody. Like, if you hang on, we're going to survey. Okay, fine. You want to know whether this person did a good job or not, but like you're really not interested in whether I have an idea for how to make this thing better.
You always share great cartoons, illustrations with your books and on LinkedIn and stuff like that. I think you shared one once where it was a suggestion box and it was zoomed out and the person was putting in a suggestion box and underneath there was a shredder. So it was like, my idea is, that's how it feels sometimes. It's like, why bother then? But there's an exercise you give here, which is great. You surface the dogmas, you called it. And you say, so how do you cultivate contrarian tendencies and surface the dogmas in your companies? One simple device is to ask yourself and your colleagues, what are the 10 things you would never hear a customer say about our company or our industry? For example, no customer is ever going to say, the airline treats its customers with dignity and respect. Few customers would ever say, it's easy to shop for a better rate on electricity, or fewer even still would say banking is fun, or hotels have always got great food. And once you've identified what customers would not say, ask yourself why they would not say those things. I thought that was just such a simple exercise for people to do.
Yeah. Well, again, I hope that in that book, I think there are a lot of like fairly simple things, because these do have to become habits. They have to be routines. And without it, they're not going to have any impact. But it is interesting to me how an industry can get it wrong for so long. Recently, some of the airline industries have started tying their loyalty programs to how much you actually spend. Well, of course you should. It's not how many miles you fly that makes you a valuable customer. It's how profitable you are, right? And so, you go like, wow, it took you guys a long time to like figure that. And of course, now all those super frequent flyers who weren't making the airline any money are pissed off about that. So fine, you better figure out a way of dealing with that. But I mean, there is, I think, in every business and every industry, there's literally an infinite number of ways you can make that thing. And the only question is like, okay, do your employees feel empowered to think in new ways? Is there a place for them to go with their ideas? Better yet, can they experiment with that locally without having to like a lot of permission? If an idea is good, how quickly can I get it tested? How does it then propagate across the system? How long does that take? And you just start to, these are very, very simple ideas. How many ideas of what quality? How quickly are they tested? How efficiently are they tested? How quickly do they get shared across the system? And those things together absolutely drive the rate at which any business can get better. And yet if you take every one of those elements, and employees actually listening every day, do they have a place to go with those ideas? Do we actually then turn those into experiments? He's just like, no. So, yeah. Sometimes it's been frustrating.
But, man, I tell you, it's why I'm so happy to share the book, because not much has changed. And, that Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, that the names have changed of the companies, the industries, etc., but the challenges just creep back in. And it's almost like a cycle of the companies that listened at the start were either entrepreneurial, or they were entrepreneurs who read your book, listened to it, took action. Mm-hmm. But then they get to the top of their S-curve and they stop doing it because they're so busy. And then the other guys come in, and I really want to stop that cycle. And I want those companies who are at the top of the curve to realize and to wake up and see it's not that you're broken, you're human, you're biased, you get blinded, you get stuck in the exploit phase and stop exploring. And there's a formula to fix this if you really want to.
Yeah, and I think, the really want to is certainly part of it. But, what I had to recognize, and we've talked about this, it took me a long time, too long, is there was a reason so often these things were falling on deaf ears, right? It wasn't that the CEOs didn't care about this. It wasn't that they were willingly blind or whatever. But all of these employees caught in a system where these things are just not rewarded. I came across this wonderful, funny blog, bitter and funny and so on, by some young employee saying that their whole life now is spent navigating between a bunch of bullshit tools like Zoom and Trello and Notion and whatever. None of them are connected together. And we spend all of our days like entering data and filling these things out. And we're in a system that now 100% mistakes activity for achievement. And, and we're all just feeding these various, data hungry systems that are mostly designed so people above us can tell, and, we just fall into these traps in organizations that everybody there goes like, this is stupid, right? Or maybe not. Maybe a lot of them are just unthinking and they're just in the system. So it's a system level problem that has to be solved, right? There are organizations where, as I say, activity is mistaken for accomplishment, where you look at most of your customers as people inside the organization, not outside the organization, where there's very little upside for new ideas and for taking the risk to pioneer them. There's very little downside to killing an idea because nobody's ever going to come back and say, like, why the hell did you kill that? That was a promising idea. There's no accountability there. Most people have no idea what a P&L is. And so they're managing to bullshit KPIs and other things that are only tangentially related to actually having a good business outcome. Most frontline employees have not been given business skills. I mean, so this is a system, right? And that's why my book's changed and the focus has changed. Is like, all right, guys, we got to step back and change the system. Having said that, if you make the investment in yourself and you make the investment in seeing into the future, and if you teach yourself how to be a contrarian and so on, you will still have a way bigger impact than you would otherwise. I mean, you may not be able to change the whole system, but despite everything I said, CEOs, leaders are still hungry for new ideas. They want people who will take the risk of doing something. I talked it out in that book of how do you become an internal rebel. And even despite those things all around you, not letting those dissuade you or put you off or wait for the system to change, because that's a pretty hopeless situation to be in too.
I think what we'll do, Gary, is we'll keep that for the next day if you're cool with that. We'll do the corporate rebels, give a couple of those examples, and the idea of to change the business model, you need to change the mental model, but also the political model behind it. We'll do a coverage of that. So I have some diagrams. A couple of last ones maybe to wrap this chapter. I thought we'd get through more, but I love the fact that you've built on these ideas and that also you're willing to share some of the experiences you've had in the field from working with clients. I think that's the unique thing. You're not only writing this, but you're an academic, you're a practitioner, you're a consultant, but you're out there with really successful companies, which really makes it interesting. But one of the things that you talked about in the early books, the competence-based competition, for example, was the idea that your capabilities or competences can actually be the competitive advantage. But you say in this book, you can distinguish form from function. And I think this is a really key term to share with our audiences. Any company can't distinguish between form and function will get caught inside an obsolete form factor. And you say one way of distinguishing function from form is to substitute a verb for a noun. Rick Kovacic, I'm butchering his name there, but at the time he was CEO of Wells Fargo, provides an example. Banking is essential, but banks are not. Banks are things, bricks and mortar. Banking is a function. And maybe you'd share an idea on that, because that's a really great one for people to start thinking about their own business.
Yeah, I think Clay Christensen had a different way of talking about this. I think he talked about jobs to be done, maybe. It was a language he used. But I do think, you end up caught inside of a particular business model, a particular way of delivering a customer benefit, and you lose sight of, well, what's the real benefit? And are there other ways to do that? You look at now, banks have basically become an app, right? As many things have, right? So the function is still there. Newspapers have become an app, right? I mean, you still consume the news, but in a completely different way. Music, the same kind of thing. We were talking a few minutes ago about education, right? Well, I think I want to be careful about saying universities are going to disappear. They're maybe almost the longest lived human institutions we have, right? Oxford, Cambridge, and these places go back. Having said that, and so they'll still exist in some form. But I think if you look at how education is delivered more generally, the university is just a particular form, a way of delivering knowledge, human expertise, capability, even research. And if you're wedded to that, you lose, right? Your commitment has to be not to a particular business model or structure. The commitment has to be, we're trying to make a difference in people's lives. We're trying to do something amazing. And we're going to find the best, most efficient, most amazing tools to do that. And the moment you lose sight of that and you become hostage to a particular form factor or delivery channel or whatever, you've opened the door for somebody else to take the future.
Brilliant, man. I have one last quote, and I'd love you to riff on this one. This was kind of like what you said about Steve Jobs changing from Apple computer to Apple, the power of language and the power of labeling something and how we get stuck in that. You said that in most companies, there is no distinction between a conversation about radical new possibilities and a conversation about how to eke out another percentage point of gross margin. The same standards of analytical rigor are applied to both, whether the subject is the return on a new piece of production machinery or the chance to create an entirely new market. Strategy conversations at GE Capital at the time were labeled dreaming sessions, questions about internal rate of return and EVA are disallowed. No one mistakes them then for budgeting meetings. I thought that was a really important point.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, G Capital, I think, imploded with a financial crisis. So the examples are sometimes better at the time than they are, but that's, you can't write a book without taking that risk.
But isn't that the point, though, Gary? I mean, I think that's a really important point, and something that somebody could be critical and go, "Hey, that didn't work." But that's the point. That
the point, yeah, and GE GE Capital got caught much more on the operational side and just this endless quest to do deals and expand for the sake of expanding and getting bigger. So they had those sessions. I'd be surprised if anything came out of them. Having said that, absolutely right. And I think, there's one of the things we're fighting behind all of this, Aiden, is not only kind of systems and structures, but we're fighting kind of a managerialist mindset. And if you look at the kinds of people who move up in our organizations, analysts, program managers, administrators, finance people, and so on, and for them, pragmatism always has the veto on any idea. And so the quickest way you can kill, and particularly as you were saying there, when you can't distinguish between a highly operational thing where you should expect to have a lot of data, you should expect a high degree of certainty, you're right to demand it. If you walk into every conversation with that mindset, like I'm here to pull your idea apart, to pressure test it, to find the weak point, and so on, you will never do anything that's truly new, because the things that are new by definition cannot be evaluated using those criteria. There's not enough evidence. There's not enough data. There's not enough history. There's too much that's unknown. And I've seen this happen again and again as I've watched young teams that get excited. We help them to get excited about some new idea. They've done a lot of work and thought it through, and they come to present. And then you have some like gravelly voiced old timer say, well, of course we have to be realistic. And like, you destroy the idea, you destroy the spirit of those kids and like whatever. And, when you're thinking about the future, being realistic is a very different thing. Being realistic means, are we seeing the world in the right way? Like, we could be very clear. Do we have the right assumptions? Are people really frustrated? Is this technology really evolving at the rate we think it is? So it's not that you're fact-free and that you're just riffing it. You can say, what do we believe here? Is it credible to believe it? But you can't ask, how much money is this going to make? I'm trying to think of the company. I think it was W.O. Gore. They pioneered the long-term innovator material science, but they had a simple model called real win worth. It's probably in one of my books. And so if you have a new idea, I'll give you a really practical little case study. Gore, they make Gore-Tex, right? Which is an amazing performance fabric. It's in all kinds of things, and they get paid a lot of money for it. Somebody at Gore said, could we put this in shoes? Because a lot of people are running outside in inclement weather. And it had never been done before. And there are a lot of technical challenges in making that fabric flexible enough to stand up and not lose its properties as you're flexing in a shoe. They spent years doing this. And it wasn't a big team, but nobody said stop, because the first question they'd ask the Gore, is there a real opportunity? You go like, okay, there are a lot of people live in inclement areas and they want to exercise. Okay, yeah, that's big. Okay, like keep going, right? That wasn't so hard to figure out, right? But it wasn't that it was a fantasy, like, here's the data, here's the number of people, here's how much it rains in Ireland, wherever. Yeah, let's do this. So that's the first question. Is it real? And you can go for a long time just with that alone. At some point, somebody's going to ask, can we win? Which means, okay, it's real, but do we have any right to play here? Do we have any competencies, any capabilities that, or is this somehow in our wheelhouse? But that's the secondary question. And of course, for Gore, the answer was yes. And then finally, somebody's going to say, worth. Okay, can we monetize this? Is there enough value here that people will pay us? We can cover our costs. We can make a margin. Is it really important? So often, I think in companies, when new ideas come up, all three of those questions get asked at the same time. Real win worth. And the last one is the killer, because if you can't say like right now, like, yeah, it's going to be worth X. Yeah, we can. And so that's why I think companies so often miss the future, because in fact, it's very interesting. We've done this a lot in our research and our consulting. Very interesting question to ask in an organization, companies. What are the opportunities that we missed where we could have played, where we had enough capability, expertise we could have played, but we're not there? And then you want to go back and do some real diagnosis and say, did we never see it? And often people did see it. All right. Did we under-resource it? Yeah. Did we kill it prematurely? Yeah. Did the team behind it get frustrated and leave or get reassigned? Yeah. So you cannot take that highly pragmatic, hardcore data-driven mentality and apply it to every question or every opportunity. And yet that is the managerialist mindset and the inclination to do that. And by the way, you get a little buzz of feeling superior and feeling good when you pull somebody else's idea down. That's often the unfortunate truth as well. And I told it was like a dumb idea.
The audience experience that all the time, but those of you who are CEOs, take heed of that. And we all tend to do it. We see things through our own perspective. To Gary's point, you'll see the same thing. You'll see it totally different. Let the organization see it. Gary, it's always a great pleasure. I thought we'd get 2 chapters done today. I'm glad we didn't, because I really want to go into the next chapter, which is corporate rebels. There's some great heroes, corporate rebels in that chapter. But more, I want to talk about the kind of structures of navigating political hierarchies, because that's a huge challenge when it comes to status. And to the point you just said there about trying to get around those people who will condemn your idea early. For people who want to find you, Gary, where's the best place for them to reach out?
GaryHamel.com, email Gary@GaryHamel.com, Prof. Hamel on X, and you'll find me on LinkedIn as well.
Brilliant. And don't forget, all those books are available that adorn the shelves behind me there. We were covering Leading the Revolution, author of Leading Revolution, Gary Hamel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Aiden.